Some stories do not announce themselves. They don't arrive with sirens or headlines. They wait. They wait beneath the floorboards of ordinary homes while families live their lives just inches above, unaware of what time has left behind. In 1987, on Charlotte Avenue in Nashville, a routine renovation uncovered the unthinkable. Not one set of remains, but two. Hidden, removed from memory, preserved only by the dark. One of those individuals was a woman. Investigators couldn't find her records, they couldn't find her family, so they gave her a name that was never meant to be permanent, a name meant only to fill a blank space in a folder. They called her Sheila. For nearly 40 years, Sheila was a name without a history, a ghost in the Nashville PD archives. But while the city moved on, 1,000 miles away, a daughter was growing up with a hole in her life, searching for a mother who had vanished into thin air. Tonight, we reveal the moment the silence finally broke, how a single image found on a late-night internet search crashed two worlds together, and how 2025 technology finally forced the ground beneath Charlotte Avenue to give up its final, most devastating secret. This is the story of the woman who was Sheila and the real name she waited 4 decades to hear again. To understand how a life disappears, you have to understand the geography of Charlotte Avenue. In 1987, this wasn't just a road, it was a corridor of secrets. The houses here were built with crawl spaces, shallow, dark voids between the floorboards and the earth. They were never meant for people. They were meant for pipes, wires, and the things we want to keep out of sight. When the workmen crawled under the foundation that afternoon, they expected cobwebs and dry rot. They didn't expect a tomb. The first thing they saw wasn't a face, it was a texture, something that didn't match the limestone and Nashville clay. As they cleared the debris, the realization didn't hit all at once, it crept in. One set of remains was found, then just feet away, a second. The work stopped. The city's hum above continued, but in that small, dirt-filled space, time had officially frozen. When the Metro Nashville police arrived, they were faced with a forensic nightmare. There was no ID, no jewelry that told a story, just two people who had been placed there with the intent that they would never be found. In the lab, the female victim became a puzzle that refused to be solved. Based on the clothing fragments and the state of the remains, they knew she had been there for years. But who was she? She wasn't in the local missing persons files. Her fingerprints yielded nothing. In 1987, DNA was a laboratory dream, not a police tool. The lead investigator, frustrated by the Jane Doe label, needed a way to talk about her. He needed to make her human, if only to keep the case alive. From a whisper in the precinct or a scribble on a notepad, the name emerged: Sheila. It was a name of convenience, a ghost name, but for the next 38 years, Sheila would be the only identity she had. She was a woman who had been erased twice, once by her killer and once by the limitations of 1980s science. While Sheila lay in a cold storage box in Tennessee, 3 states away, a young woman was living a life defined by an absence. She remembered a mother who loved her. She remembered a day when that mother simply didn't come home. She grew up watching the news, looking at every face in the crowd, wondering if her mother had started a new life or if she was out there somewhere waiting to be found. She didn't know that her mother was already found. She didn't know her mother had been renamed by a stranger in a lab. But in 2025, the digital world was about to do what the physical world couldn't. She was about to scroll past a facial reconstruction image that would stop her heart. When the remains were removed from beneath the home on Charlotte Avenue, the immediate focus shifted from discovery to understanding. What had been found could not speak for itself. Whatever story existed would need to be reconstructed slowly, carefully, and with limited information. In 1987, forensic science had boundaries that are difficult to imagine today. Investigators worked with what they had, not with what they hoped for. Every conclusion came with qualifiers. Every estimate came with margins that could not be narrowed further. The first step was to establish the most basic facts. From examination alone, specialists could determine that the remains belonged to adults. Bone structure provided indicators of gender. Measurements suggested approximate age ranges, though not exact years. These assessments were not guesses, but they were not precise either. They existed within windows rather than dates. Time since death was even harder to determine. Environmental conditions beneath a home are relatively stable but not controlled. Temperature, moisture, and airflow vary. As a result, conclusions could only place the remains within a broad span of years. What investigators could say with confidence was this: these individuals had been there for a long time. Not months, not recent years, but long enough that no active missing persons report immediately matched what had been found. One of the individuals was a woman. Her remains would soon become the focal point of most inquiries. This was not because the other individual mattered less, but because fragments of possible identifying information appeared to surround her case. At some point during the early stages of the investigation, a name surfaced: Sheila. It did not appear on any official document tied to confirmed identity. It did not come from dental charts or medical files. It emerged from partial information, informal references, and investigative necessity. When investigators lack a confirmed name, they often assign a working label. This allows communication. It allows discussion. It allows the case to exist as something other than a series of numbers. Sheila was never meant to replace her real name. It was simply a way to acknowledge her humanity while the search continued. The second set of remains, however, received far less public attention. From the beginning, information about that individual remained limited in media coverage. There were fewer leads, fewer points of reference, no provisional name that entered public discussion. This imbalance would shape how the case was remembered. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the investigation settled into a slower rhythm. Evidence was cataloged, findings were reviewed, files were assembled with care. But even at this early stage, the limits of the era were becoming clear. In the 1980s, identification relied heavily on comparison. Someone had to already be looking for you. Someone had to have filed a report. Someone had to notice the overlap between a missing person and unidentified remains. There was no centralized national system that connected every jurisdiction. Records were stored locally, often on paper, sometimes incomplete, sometimes outdated. If a person went missing in one state and was found in another, the connection depended entirely on human memory, communication, and chance. Investigators reviewed local missing persons files. They looked for women whose descriptions might align with what they could estimate. They checked available dental records. They searched for anything that could serve as a bridge between the remains and a living memory. Dental records were one of the most valuable tools available at the time, but they required something specific: a match. A dental chart only helps if it exists, and only if it can be compared to what is found. Many adults in the 1980s had limited dental documentation. Some had never visited a dentist regularly. Others had records stored in offices that had long since closed. Personal effects could sometimes offer clues. Clothing, jewelry, or other items might suggest a time frame or lifestyle, but items deteriorate, and even when they are preserved, they rarely carry names. In this case, there was little that could point clearly to a specific individual. The investigation pressed forward, but without momentum. There were no immediate matches, no clear missing person whose story aligned perfectly with the discovery. As time passed, attention naturally shifted. New cases emerged. Other investigations demanded resources. Detectives were reassigned. Files were moved from desks to cabinets. Sheila remained unidentified. The name appeared in internal discussions. It surfaced occasionally in media references. But without progress, it began to feel less like a placeholder and more like a permanent label. For the second individual, however, silence was even deeper. Without a working name or public narrative, that part of the case existed almost entirely within archived paperwork, mentioned in reports, recorded in evidence logs, but rarely discussed beyond official channels. This uneven visibility did not reflect importance, it reflected practicality. Investigators followed the paths that seemed most likely to lead somewhere, even if those paths eventually ended. By the early 1990s, the case had reached a familiar stage. It was not closed, but it was no longer active. That distinction matters. An open case means questions remain, but without new information, those questions wait quietly. Years passed. Technology advanced in other areas, but forensic identification remained largely unchanged for cases like this. DNA existed as a concept, but not as a widespread investigative tool. There were no databases that could link remains to relatives who had never submitted samples. Families of missing persons continued to search in their own ways. Some moved, some stopped filing inquiries, some held on to hope quietly. In the absence of confirmation, uncertainty became a kind of permanence. For investigators who remembered the case, Sheila represented unfinished work. For the city, it became a forgotten headline. For the remains themselves, time continued to pass without recognition. This is how many cases from that era remained unresolved, not because of neglect, but because the tools required to solve them simply did not yet exist. Identification in the 1980s relied heavily on comparison. Someone had to already be looking for you. Someone had to have filed a report. Someone had to notice the overlap between a missing person and unidentified remains. There was no centralized national system that connected every jurisdiction. Records were stored locally, often on paper, sometimes incomplete, sometimes outdated. If a person went missing in one state and was found in another, the connection depended entirely on human memory, communication, and chance. Investigators reviewed local missing persons files. They looked for women whose descriptions might align with what they could estimate. They checked available dental records. They searched for anything that could serve as a bridge between the remains and a living memory. Dental records were one of the most valuable tools available at the time, but they required something specific, a match. A dental chart only helps if it exists, and only if it can be compared to what is found. Many adults in the 1980s had limited dental documentation. Some had never visited a dentist regularly. Others had records stored in offices that had long since closed. Personal effects could sometimes offer clues. Clothing, jewelry, or other items might suggest a time frame or lifestyle, but items deteriorate, and even when they are preserved, they rarely carry names. In this case, there was little that could point clearly to a specific individual. The investigation pressed forward, but without momentum. There were no immediate matches, no clear missing person whose story aligned perfectly with the discovery. As time passed, attention naturally shifted. New cases emerged. Other investigations demanded resources. Detectives were reassigned. Files were moved from desks to cabinets. Sheila remained unidentified. The name appeared in internal discussions. It surfaced occasionally in media references, but without progress, it began to feel less like a placeholder and more like a permanent label. For the second individual, however, silence was even deeper. Without a working name or public narrative, that part of the case existed almost entirely within archived paperwork, mentioned in reports, recorded in evidence logs,
but rarely discussed beyond official channels. This uneven visibility did not reflect importance, it reflected practicality. Investigators followed the paths that seemed most likely to lead somewhere, even if those paths eventually ended. By the early 1990s, the case had reached a familiar stage. It was not closed, but it was no longer active. That distinction matters. An open case means questions remain, but without new information, those questions wait quietly. Years passed. Technology advanced in other areas, but forensic identification remained largely unchanged for cases like this.
A name is usually the beginning of a story. It connects a person to family, to memory, to a place in the world. But sometimes a name appears only after everything else is gone. In this case, the name Sheila did not arrive with certainty. It did not come from a birth certificate or an identification card. It emerged slowly, cautiously, and without confirmation. In the days following the discovery beneath the home on Charlotte Avenue, investigators searched for anything that could help distinguish one set of remains from the other. They needed a way to talk about the case. They needed language that allowed discussion, documentation, and coordination. At some point during this process, a name surfaced through informal channels. It may have come from an unverified recollection. It may have been mentioned by someone familiar with the property, or by someone who believed they recognized a detail connected to the remains. It may have been a partial memory offered without certainty, shared with the hope that it might help. What is known is that the name was never supported by official records. There was no matching missing persons report at the time that could confirm it. There was no documentation tying that name directly to the individual found beneath the home. Still, the name remained. In investigations involving unidentified individuals, provisional labels are not uncommon. They allow communication among investigators. They make reports easier to follow. They prevent cases from becoming nothing more than numbers. And so, Sheila entered the case file. At first, it was a quiet reference, used internally, cautiously, with the understanding that it might later be replaced. But as time passed and no alternative emerged, the name began to appear more frequently. When the case reached the media, the name followed. For reporters, a name creates connection. It turns an abstract discovery into a human story. It gives audiences something to remember. Sheila was easier to say than unidentified female remains. It carried familiarity, even without proof. And slowly, it became the way the case was known. This shift had consequences. On one hand, the use of a name helped keep the case from disappearing entirely. It allowed the public to engage with it as more than a technical investigation. It suggested that the person found beneath the home had once lived a full life, even if the details of that life were unknown. On the other hand, the name also created limits. Once Sheila became established in public discussion, it shaped how the case was searched and remembered. Investigators looked for missing persons named Sheila. Members of the public who might have known the individual by another name did not recognize the connection. A provisional label, meant to be temporary, began to narrow the field. This is one of the quiet challenges of long-term investigations. Tools that help at one stage can complicate another. Every choice made with limited information carries consequences that may not become clear for years. As the months passed, the name Sheila became fixed in the story, but the story itself did not grow. There were no new leads, no confirmed matches, no family members who came forward with certainty. Investigators continued to check records as best they could. They reviewed missing persons reports within the region. They followed up on tips when they appeared, but none led to identification. The second individual found beneath the home remained even further removed from public awareness. Without a provisional name, that part of the case stayed almost entirely within official documentation. This imbalance was not intentional. It reflected the reality of attention, both investigative and public. Over time, the pace of the case slowed. New investigations demanded resources. Personnel changed. Detectives who had worked the case moved on to other assignments. Some retired. When detectives retire, they take with them something that cannot be archived easily. They take memory. They take intuition built from years of experience. They take the small details that never made it into reports. As leadership changed within departments, older cases were reviewed less frequently, not because they were forgotten, but because they were always newer cases requiring immediate action. The file labeled with the name Sheila was moved from active investigation to long-term storage. It did not disappear. It was not closed. It simply waited. Years passed. Technology changed daily life, but it did not immediately change the fate of cases like this one. The internet expanded access to information, but early on it was not a tool for forensic identification. Databases remained fragmented, records remained scattered, public attention faded. The discovery that once raised questions across Nashville became a distant memory for most residents. New developments, new stories, and new concerns filled the space where this case once stood. Sheila became a reference point in lists of unidentified individuals, a brief mention in summaries of unresolved cases, a line or two in archived news articles. For many, the name carried no context. It was simply one among many. But for investigators who remembered the case, the name carried weight. It represented a person who had not yet been returned to her identity. It represented unfinished responsibility, and it represented the limitations of an era. As the years turned into decades, the file remained intact. Paper records were preserved. Evidence was stored according to procedure. Updates were rare, but documentation remained careful. This persistence mattered, even when it seemed inconsequential, because while the case rested quietly in archives, life continued elsewhere. Families lived without answers. Children became adults. Memories softened around the edges, but questions did not disappear. Somewhere beyond Nashville, a daughter continued to carry the absence of her mother. She did not know that the name Sheila existed in connection with unidentified remains. She did not know that the answers she sought were already part of an unresolved case. From her perspective, the story had ended abruptly years earlier. A disappearance without explanation, a silence that stretched on without resolution. This separation between knowledge and experience is one of the defining features of long-unsolved cases. Information exists, but it does not reach the people who need it. Answers are possible, but not accessible. Sheila, as a name, existed in a space between recognition and anonymity. It suggested familiarity, but it concealed truth. It kept the case alive just enough to be remembered, but not enough to be solved. As the 1990s passed into the 2000s, the world changed rapidly. Communication became faster. Records began to move into digital formats. Investigative methods evolved. But for cases rooted in discoveries made decades earlier, progress was slow. Many departments lacked the resources to revisit every unresolved file. Priorities remained focused on active investigations. Cold cases were reviewed selectively, often only when new information emerged. For Sheila, no such information appeared for a long time. The name remained static. The file remained closed to new development. The case became a quiet footnote in Nashville's history. It was not a case discussed often. It was not referenced in documentaries or major retrospectives. It existed in the background, known mainly to those who sought it out. And yet, the story was not over. What no one could foresee was that the very thing that had once limited the case, the absence of confirmation, the lack of connection, would eventually be overcome by a tool that did not rely on names at all, a tool that did not require a missing persons report filed in the correct jurisdiction, a tool that did not depend on chance recognition. But at this point in the story, that future remained unseen. For now, Sheila remained a name without a story, a label assigned in uncertainty, a reference passed from report to report, a reminder that identification is not immediate and that time alone does not guarantee answers. As the years moved forward, the case rested quietly among countless others, waiting for a reason to be reopened, waiting for technology to catch up, waiting for someone to recognize a connection, waiting for the moment when silence would finally give way to clarity.
To understand what was missing from the investigation, the story must move backward in time. 3 years before the discovery beneath the home on Charlotte Avenue, a woman disappeared from her life without explanation. Her absence did not come with headlines. It did not immediately draw wide attention. It arrived quietly, as many disappearances do, leaving questions that had no place to go. Her name was Sheila Cummings. In 1984, Sheila was known to those around her as dependable and present. She was a mother. She worked. She maintained routines that gave shape to her days. Her life was not defined by mystery or uncertainty, but by responsibility. To the people who knew her, Sheila's presence was consistent. She was part of a household. She was part of a family. Her role was not something that could easily be overlooked or replaced. When someone like that is suddenly gone, the absence is immediate. There is no gradual adjustment. There is no slow realization. The space they leave behind is noticeable from the first day. In 1984, when Sheila was last seen, there was no reason to believe that moment would become significant. There were no signs that it would be the last confirmed sighting. There were no indicators that it marked the beginning of a long search. And then, she did not return. At first, those closest to her tried to account for the absence in ordinary ways. Delays happen, plans change, life interrupts itself. But as time passed, concern grew. Phone calls went unanswered. Expected routines were broken. The reassurance of familiarity was replaced by silence. Eventually, Sheila was reported missing. This step is often more difficult than it appears. Families hesitate, hoping that answers will arrive on their own. They balance worry against the fear of overreacting. But when uncertainty continues, reporting a disappearance becomes an act of necessity. When the report was made, it entered a system that was limited by its era. Records were local. Information traveled slowly. Unless there was evidence pointing clearly toward a specific outcome, cases could linger without resolution. At the time, there was no immediate reason to connect Sheila's disappearance with any other investigation. There were no known links to the discovery that would later take place beneath the home in Nashville. The two events existed separately, unaware of one another. For Sheila's family, the report was not the end of the process. It was the beginning of a long period defined by waiting. Waiting for updates, waiting for calls that might bring news, waiting for explanations that never arrived. For her daughter, life changed in ways that could not be fully understood at the time. Children experience absence differently than adults. They may not have the language to describe what they feel, but the impact shapes them all the same. Growing up without a parent creates questions that evolve over time. At first, the questions are simple. When will she come back? Why isn't she here? As years pass, those questions grow more complex. They become harder to ask and harder to answer. For Sheila's daughter, the disappearance became part of her personal history. It was not something she chose to carry, but something that accompanied her through each stage of life. School milestones passed without explanation. Holidays arrived with a missing presence. Moments that should have included shared experience instead carried silence. Families adapt because they must. Daily routines continue. Responsibilities are redistributed. Life moves forward, even when understanding does not. But adaptation does not mean resolution. The absence remains. For many families of missing individuals, there is a tension between hope and acceptance. Hope that the person will return, acceptance that time continues regardless. That tension does not fade easily. As the years moved forward, Sheila's daughter learned to live with uncertainty. She learned to build her life around what was known rather than what was unanswered. But the questions did not disappear. Where had her mother gone? What had happened in those final days? Why had no answers emerged? From the outside, life appeared ordinary. From the inside, there was always an unspoken gap. This experience is not unique. Families across the country carry similar stories. Disappearances that never resolve leave a different kind of impact than confirmed loss. There is no final moment, no ceremony that marks an ending, only a prolonged state of not knowing. For Sheila's daughter, this meant growing up without the ability to place her mother's story within a clear timeline. There was no certainty to rely on, only fragments of memory and unanswered questions. As she became an adult, the disappearance became part of her identity, not in a defining way, but in a quiet, persistent one. It influenced how she viewed stability, how she approached relationships, how she understood absence. And yet, like many families in similar situations, she continued forward. She built a life. She found ways to move through the world, but the unanswered questions remained just beneath the surface. Meanwhile, elsewhere, the name Sheila existed in a completely separate context. In Nashville, unidentified remains rested in storage. Files were preserved. A provisional name appeared in reports, but there was no line connecting these two realities. The disappearance of Sheila Cummings and the discovery beneath the home on Charlotte Avenue existed in parallel, separated by time, geography, and limited information systems. This separation is one of the defining characteristics of unresolved cases from earlier decades. Without centralized records, connections depended on chance. Someone had to notice similarities. Someone had to ask the right question. Someone had to have access to both sides of the story. In this case, that connection did not occur. As years passed, Sheila's disappearance became part of family history rather than public record. It was remembered through personal stories rather than official updates. Her daughter carried memories that were incomplete but deeply felt. She remembered her mother as a presence rather than as a mystery. That distinction matters. To investigators, Sheila Cummings was a missing person. To her daughter, she was simply a mother who did not return. These two perspectives rarely align nicely. As time moved forward, the absence of answers became a kind of background noise, always present but not always spoken aloud. Life milestones continued, the world changed, technology advanced, but the question of what happened in 1984 remained unchanged. This kind of long-term uncertainty shapes families in subtle ways. It influences how people process change, how they respond to loss, how they understand closure. For Sheila's daughter, closure was not something she expected. She had learned to live without it. And yet, the human mind continues to seek understanding, even when it seems unreachable. Sometimes that search is active. Sometimes it is quiet. Years later, long after the disappearance had faded from public attention, a new era of information began to take shape. But at this point in the story, that future was still unseen. For now, Sheila Cummings existed in memory, not in records. Her name was spoken by family, not by investigators. Her story remained incomplete, and her daughter continued living with a question that had followed her from childhood into adulthood. A question that would wait patiently, just as the case in Nashville had waited, waiting for the moment when two separate stories would finally meet. time does not stand still, even when cases do. While files rested quietly in storage rooms and archives, the world outside those rooms changed in ways that would eventually reshape investigations across the country. The passage of years brought new tools, new methods, and new possibilities, none of which were available when the remains beneath the home on Charlotte Avenue were first discovered. For much of the late 20th century, identification relied on comparison. A missing person had to be reported, records had to exist, someone had to notice a match between two separate files. But as the decades moved forward, a different approach began to emerge, one that did not depend on names, photographs, or memory. It depended on biology. At its core, DNA identification is based on a simple idea. Every person carries a unique genetic pattern. That pattern is shared, in part, with biological relatives. In the early days, DNA profiling was limited. It required direct comparison between known samples and evidence. If no comparison sample existed, the process could go no further. Over time, this changed. Advances in laboratory methods made it possible to extract genetic material from older evidence. Improvements in computing allowed large amounts of data to be stored and compared efficiently. And most importantly, databases began to grow. These databases were not built overnight. They expanded gradually, fueled by voluntary participation, legal frameworks, and public interest. As more people contributed genetic information for ancestry research, a new form of connection became possible. Familial matching does not require an exact match. Instead, it looks for shared markers that suggest a biological relationship, a parent, a child, a sibling, even more distant relatives. This approach transformed cold case investigations. Cases that had once stalled due to lack of direct evidence could now be revisited with fresh perspective. Unidentified individuals could be compared against a growing network of genetic profiles, even if their immediate family members had never been part of an investigation. Across the United States, departments began reopening files that had not been touched in years. Some of these cases resulted in identifications that families had long believed would never come. Others led to renewed questions, new leads, and new understanding. This shift did not erase the challenges of older cases. Evidence still needed to be preserved, records still needed to be accessible, and families still needed to be willing to participate. But for the first time, time itself began to work in favor of resolution rather than against it. For cases like the one in Nashville, this change was significant. The unidentified remains found beneath the home had been carefully stored. Documentation, though created in an earlier era, still existed. The case had not been closed, only paused. As the Metro Nashville Police Department moved into the 21st century, efforts to modernize records became a priority. Paper files were reviewed, information was transferred into digital systems. Cases that had once been difficult to search became easier to access. This process required patience. Old reports had to be interpreted, handwritten notes had to be transcribed, details recorded decades earlier had to be understood within the context of their time. But each step brought clarity. Unidentified remains cases were among those selected for review, not because they were high profile, but because they represented unfinished work. For investigators, naming the unidentified is a responsibility that does not expire. It is a commitment to restore identity, even when answers arrive late. As part of this effort, the remains discovered in 1987 were re-examined. Advances in forensic science allowed for new analysis that had not been possible before. Samples that once yielded limited information could now provide more. DNA profiles were created where possible. These profiles did not immediately reveal names, but they opened doors that had once been closed. At the same time, the way information reached the public had changed. In earlier decades, appeals relied on newspapers, local broadcasts, and word of mouth. Their reach was limited by geography and timing. Now, information could be shared instantly and widely. Online platforms allowed departments to post images, descriptions, and case summaries that could be seen by people far beyond city limits. Social media made it possible for stories to be shared, discussed, and revisited. For unidentified individuals, this visibility mattered. It meant that someone who had moved away, someone who had lost touch, or someone who had never seen the original coverage might now encounter the case for the first time. Metro Nashville police began using these tools carefully and responsibly. The goal was not attention for its own sake, but connection. Public appeals were crafted to present factual information clearly and respectfully. Descriptions focused on identification rather than speculation. Images were shared with sensitivity. Among these posts was information about an unidentified woman found beneath a home decades earlier. She was still referred to by the name Sheila. The post did not claim certainty. It did not suggest conclusions. It simply asked a question. Does this person look familiar? Does this description align with someone you once knew? For years, such posts had produced little response, but with time, the audience changed. People who had grown up with unanswered questions were now adults. They had access to information their parents never had. They could search, compare, and reflect in ways that were once impossible. For families of missing persons, this digital landscape offered both hope and hesitation. Hope that answers might finally emerge, hesitation rooted in years of disappointment. Some chose not to look. Others followed these posts quietly, unsure of what they might find. In Nashville, the renewed focus on unidentified remains was part of a broader effort to address unresolved cases with modern tools. Investigators did not expect immediate breakthroughs. They understood that many cases would remain unanswered, but they also understood that every name restored mattered. Each answer replaced uncertainty with clarity. As the department continued its work, the case labeled Sheila remained active within this renewed framework. DNA profiles were entered into databases. Records were reviewed once more. Online information was updated. And then something happened that could not have occurred in earlier decades. Someone saw the post. Not an investigator, not a reporter, but a family member. For years, Sheila Cummings' daughter had lived with questions that had no clear place to go. She had learned to carry uncertainty without expecting resolution. But the internet has a way of bringing the past into the present. Images surface, stories reappear, connections form unexpectedly. When she encountered information about the unidentified woman known as Sheila, something stood out. It was not certainty, it was recognition. A detail, a description, a sense that this story intersected with her own. This moment did not arrive with confidence, it arrived with hesitation. Reaching out to authorities after years of silence requires courage. It requires reopening questions that have been managed carefully for a long time. But the tools now existed to explore that possibility. She contacted the Metro Nashville Police Department. The response was measured and professional. Investigators understood the significance of such outreach. They did not promise answers, they explained the process. DNA testing was discussed. Participation was voluntary. Expectations were set carefully. For the first time in decades, two separate timelines began to align. The disappearance reported in 1984, the remains discovered in 1987, the technology developed years later. None of these elements alone could resolve the case. Together, they created a path forward. As samples were collected and analysis began, the case moved from archive to active review. This stage required patience. DNA comparison is not instant. Results take time.
Laboratory processes are careful and deliberate. For investigators, this period was defined by procedure. For Sheila's daughter, it was defined by anticipation. The possibility of an answer carried weight, not certainty, but potential. This is the quiet power of modern identification methods. They do not guarantee resolution, but they make it possible. As weeks passed, the case progressed through the system, and for the first time since 1987, the question of who Sheila really was moved closer to an answer grounded not in assumption, but in science. The decades that had once kept the truth out of reach had finally provided the tools needed to uncover it. And with that, a long silent case prepared to enter its next chapter.
Some moments arrive without ceremony. They do not announce their importance. They appear during ordinary routines, woven into the quiet fabric of everyday life. For Sheila Cummings' daughter, that moment did not come during a planned search or an intentional investigation. It came during an ordinary day, a day like countless others that had passed since her mother disappeared. There was nothing remarkable about the setting, no sense that something meaningful was about to happen. Just the familiar rhythm of daily life, shaped over years by work, responsibility, and routine. At some point, she found herself scrolling through information online. Articles, posts, shared content that moved quickly past the screen. And then, something slowed her movement. It was a post connected to an old case, an unidentified woman, remains discovered decades earlier beneath a home in Nashville. The woman was referred to by a single name, Sheila. At first, the name alone did not confirm anything. It was common. It could have belonged to anyone. But as she read further, details began to form a picture, a time frame, a location, a brief description shaped by limited information. None of it claimed certainty. None of it offered conclusions. It simply presented facts and asked whether someone, somewhere, might recognize them. Recognition is not always immediate. It does not always arrive as a clear answer. Sometimes it begins as a feeling that something deserves closer attention. She read the post again, then again. A photograph accompanied the description, not a portrait, not a clear image of a living person, but enough to prompt reflection. Certain details felt familiar, not in a way that could be easily explained or defended, just enough to unsettle the boundary between coincidence and possibility. For someone who has lived with unanswered questions, this kind of moment carries weight. There is an instinct to look away, to keep moving, to protect the careful balance built over years of not knowing. Because reaching out means reopening a story that has long been managed quietly. It means inviting answers that may be difficult to receive. For Sheila's daughter, hesitation followed quickly. She considered the distance between her mother's disappearance and this discovery. She thought about the years that had passed. She questioned whether it was reasonable to imagine a connection. And yet, the questions she had carried for so long did not allow her to ignore the possibility. This is the space where many families of missing persons find themselves, caught between the desire for clarity and the fear of what that clarity might bring. She did not act immediately. She stepped away. She returned later. She read the post once more. Each time, the sense that this information intersected with her own history did not fade. It is important to understand what this moment represents. This was not the discovery of certainty. It was the recognition of a path that had not existed before. For decades, there had been no clear place to direct her questions, no system designed to connect her mother's disappearance with unidentified remains found elsewhere. Now, for the first time, there was a visible bridge. After careful thought, she made the decision to reach out,
not with assumptions, not with demands, but with information. The message she prepared was measured and respectful. She explained who she was. She shared the name of her mother. She referenced the year of her disappearance. She did not claim answers. She asked whether there could be a connection. When she sent the message, she did not expect immediate resolution. She understood the process well enough to know that investigations move carefully. But sending that message changed something fundamental. For the first time, the questions she had carried alone entered an official channel. On the other side, the response from authorities was careful and professional. Investigators who receive these messages understand the significance. They also understand the responsibility. They did not promise outcomes. They did not speculate. They acknowledged the information and explained the next steps. This stage of the process is defined by procedure. Family information must be reviewed. Dates and locations must be compared. Records must be checked against existing files. Nothing moves forward on assumption alone. The name Sheila Cummings was reviewed alongside the unidentified woman known as Sheila. Timelines were examined. Geographic details were compared. The overlap was enough to justify further action. At this point, investigators explained the option of DNA testing. This was not a requirement, it was a voluntary step. DNA comparison is a powerful tool, but it must be approached with care. Families are informed of what the process involves. They are told what it can and cannot provide. For Sheila's daughter, agreeing to provide a DNA sample meant stepping into unknown territory. It meant acknowledging that an answer, whatever it might be, was now possible. She agreed. The process itself was straightforward. A sample was collected according to established protocols. Chain of custody was documented. The sample was prepared for analysis. From an investigative standpoint, this was a technical step. From a personal standpoint, it carried emotional significance. Providing a DNA sample is not simply a procedural act. It is a gesture of trust. It is an acknowledgement of connection. Once the sample was submitted, the waiting began. This waiting was different from the waiting that had defined the past decades. Before, waiting meant uncertainty without direction. Now, waiting meant progress moving quietly through established systems. Laboratory analysis takes time. Comparisons are conducted carefully. Results are reviewed and confirmed before any conclusions are shared. During this period, there were no updates to follow, no daily progress to track. For investigators, this is standard. For families, it requires patience. Sheila's daughter returned to her routine, but the context had changed. Each day carried the awareness that an answer might be forming somewhere beyond her sight. This awareness did not dominate her life, but it was present. This is how long unanswered questions behave when they are finally given a path forward. They do not demand attention. They wait, quietly, for resolution. As days turned into weeks, the investigation continued. Records that had once existed in isolation were now being viewed together. The disappearance in 1984, the discovery in 1987, the provisional name that had persisted for decades. Each element was considered carefully. No conclusions were drawn prematurely. This discipline matters. When cases involve families who have waited years for answers, accuracy is essential. False certainty causes harm. Assumptions cannot replace confirmation. Only when analysis was complete would results be shared. For now, all that could be done was wait. But this waiting carried a difference. It was no longer defined by silence. It was defined by process. And that alone marked a profound shift in a story that had remained unresolved for nearly 40 years.
The online post that had once seemed like a passing piece of information had now become the point where two separate histories converged. A daughter's search, an unidentified woman, a name that had waited decades for clarity, all moving toward an answer that would soon change how this story was understood.
Waiting takes on a different meaning when an answer is finally possible. For decades, uncertainty had been a constant companion, familiar in its persistence. But now, with a DNA sample submitted and analysis underway, the waiting carried a new weight. It was no longer passive, it was active, shaped by process, procedure, and the quiet movement of information through systems designed for accuracy rather than speed. DNA analysis does not happen all at once. It unfolds in stages, each one dependent on the integrity of the last. First, the sample provided by Sheila Cummings' daughter was carefully logged. Every step was documented. Chain of custody mattered. Accuracy mattered. The sample was then prepared for comparison. This involved isolating specific genetic markers that could be reliably compared to the profile developed from the unidentified remains. Those remains, discovered decades earlier, had already undergone renewed analysis. Advances in forensic science had made it possible to extract usable genetic material even after many years. The process required precision and patience. Nothing was rushed. Laboratory specialists worked within strict standards. Quality control checks ensured that results would be dependable. Comparisons were reviewed and verified. From the outside, this period can feel like silence. There are no visible signs of progress, no updates to follow, no indication of how close the answer might be. For investigators, this waiting is familiar. For families, it is something else entirely. During these weeks, Sheila's daughter continued her life as she always had. Responsibilities did not pause. Daily routines remained. But beneath the surface of ordinary days, anticipation existed. Not in a constant state of anxiety, but as a presence that surfaced in quiet moments, during pauses in conversation, during moments of reflection. It was the awareness that the question she had carried for most of her life might finally receive an answer. This is a delicate emotional space. Hope exists, but it is cautious. Expectation is tempered by years of experience. There is an understanding that results, whatever they may be, will carry consequences. For some families, DNA analysis confirms connections. For others, it closes doors. In this case, neither outcome had yet arrived. Weeks passed. Investigators monitored the process without interference. They understood the responsibility of what they were handling. This was not just a case file, it was a family's history. When results finally became available, they did not arrive as a dramatic announcement. They arrived through established channels, reviewed by professionals trained to interpret them. The comparison was clear. The genetic markers matched. The woman known for decades as Sheila was identified as Sheila Cummings. This confirmation marked a turning point that words often struggle to capture. For years, Sheila had existed as a placeholder, a name used in the absence of certainty, a label assigned because something was needed to stand where identity should have been. Now, that placeholder was no longer necessary. Truth replaced uncertainty. For investigators, the confirmation brought a sense of completion to a chapter that had remained open for far too long. They returned to the file, now able to update it with the name that had been missing. Sheila Cummings, a full name, a documented identity, a person restored to record. This update mattered in practical ways. Reports were amended, databases were updated, the unidentified remains case was reclassified. But it also mattered in human ways. For the first time, the case could be spoken about with clarity. The woman found beneath the home was no longer anonymous.
She was no longer known only by a provisional reference. She had a name that connected her to family, to memory, to a life beyond the circumstances of her discovery. When investigators contacted Sheila's daughter with the confirmation, the conversation was handled with care. Results like these are never delivered casually. They require sensitivity. They require respect for what the information represents. For her, the confirmation brought an end to decades of uncertainty. This does not mean it brought simple relief. Truth, even when long awaited, carries complexity. There is clarity in knowing. There is also the weight of understanding what that knowledge represents. For years, she had lived with questions that had no answers. Now, one central question had been resolved. Her mother had been found. This realization reshaped her understanding of the past. Moments that at once existed without context could now be placed within a clearer narrative. The disappearance in 1984, the discovery in 1987, the long silence in between. These events were no longer disconnected. They formed a single story. For investigators, the confirmation also prompted a careful review of the case history. With the real name restored, files were re-examined with new perspective. Timelines were reviewed. Connections were reassessed. This is a standard part of identification. A name can open doors that were previously closed. It can reveal information that was once overlooked. It can allow investigators to understand the case within a broader context. Even when decades have passed, this process matters. It ensures that records are accurate. It honors the individual involved, and it provides a foundation for any remaining questions to be approached responsibly. For Sheila Cummings, identification meant that her story could finally be told with accuracy. She was no longer an unidentified woman found beneath a home. She was a mother who disappeared in 1984. She was someone who had been missed. This distinction changes everything. It changes how the case is remembered. It changes how it is discussed. It changes how it is archived. And for her daughter, it changes how she understands her own history. Knowing where her mother had been did not answer every question, but it replaced uncertainty with fact. That matters. For decades, her life had been shaped by the absence of information. Now that absence had been filled, not with speculation, but with confirmation. This moment did not erase the years that had passed. It did not undo the impact of growing up without answers, but it did bring a form of resolution that at once seemed unreachable. The identification in 2025 did more than close a case. It demonstrated the power of persistence, the importance of preserving evidence, the value of modern tools applied with care. It showed that time does not make every answer impossible. Sometimes time provides the conditions needed for clarity. As investigators finalized updates and ensured that records reflected the truth, the case entered a new phase. It was no longer about who Sheila was. It was about what her identification meant for her family, for the city of Nashville, and for the countless other cases still waiting for their moment of clarity. The confirmation in 2025 marked the end of a long chapter and the beginning of another.
Identification is more than a conclusion. It is a restoration. For decades, the woman discovered beneath the home on Charlotte Avenue existed in records as an unresolved entry. She was referenced through measurements, estimates, and technical language. Her presence in official systems was defined by what could be observed rather than who she was. That changes the moment a name is confirmed. A name does something remarkable. It turns data into history. It transforms a case from a problem to be solved into a life to be understood. When the name Sheila Cummings was officially attached to the file, the case shifted in tone and meaning. Investigators no longer spoke about an unidentified woman. They spoke about a specific person with a timeline that began long before 1987 and extended well beyond it.
This transformation is not symbolic, it has practical consequences. Once identity is restored, records can be aligned across systems. Missing person reports can finally be closed with accuracy. Archived documents can be corrected. Digital databases can reflect truth rather than placeholders. This process matters because accuracy matters. For decades, the name Sheila had served as a stand-in. It was a way to reference the case, a way to speak about the individual without knowing her. It allowed conversation to continue when certainty was unavailable. But a stand-in is never the same as identity. With the confirmation in 2025, the provisional name was no longer necessary. It was replaced by the name she had carried throughout her life, Sheila Cummings, a name given at birth, a name used by family, a name connected to memory. This shift also changed how the case was understood publicly. Stories that had once been told in abstract terms could now be grounded in reality. Discussions moved from speculation to fact. The narrative became clearer, more complete. Identification has this effect. It removes distance. It brings the individual closer to the present, closer to understanding. For investigators who had worked on the case across different decades, the confirmation brought a sense of completion. Some had inherited the file from predecessors. Others had encountered it during reviews or audits. Few expected it to ever be resolved. Cold cases often remain unresolved, not because of lack of effort, but because of limitations. Evidence degrades, leads disappear, time changes circumstances. Yet here, despite the passage of nearly 4 decades, identification became possible. This outcome reinforced the lesson that law enforcement agencies across the country have learned in recent years. Preserving evidence matters. Maintaining records matters. Revisiting old cases with new tools matters. Because sometimes the missing piece is not effort, it is time. The restoration of identity also affects how remains are treated. When a person is unidentified, their remains are often handled within a framework of uncertainty. They are cared for, documented, preserved, but without the context that comes with knowing who they were. Once identified, that context returns. Decisions can be made with family input. Arrangements can reflect personal history. Respect takes on a more complete form. For Sheila Cummings, this meant that she was no longer defined solely by the place where she was found. She was recognized for who she had been in life: a mother, a working woman, a person with relationships and responsibilities. This restoration is not about rewriting the past. It is about acknowledging it accurately. For decades, Sheila's absence had existed without explanation. Her disappearance in 1984 left behind unanswered questions. Her discovery in 1987 remained disconnected from her identity. Now, those events were linked. Identification brought coherence to a story that had long been fragmented. For her daughter, this coherence carried deep meaning. Growing up without knowing where her mother had gone shaped her understanding of the world. Uncertainty became familiar. Questions became part of daily life. Children adapt in remarkable ways. They learn to live alongside unanswered questions. They learn to carry absence without explanation. But adaptation does not erase impact. As years passed, the lack of information became a constant background presence. It influenced decisions. It shaped emotional boundaries. It informed how trust and security were understood. The confirmation in 2025 did not erase those years. It did not replace them with something simpler. What it offered was clarity. Not justice in a formal sense, not resolution in the way stories often promise, but clarity. Being able to say where her mother had been all along changed how the past could be remembered.
Instead of imagining endless possibilities, she could now anchor her memories to fact. Instead of wondering whether answers might still exist somewhere else, she knew that one central question had been answered. Her mother had been found. This knowledge carried emotional weight. Truth can be heavy even when it is welcomed. Knowing does not automatically bring peace. Sometimes it brings a new form of responsibility, the responsibility of understanding. For Sheila's daughter, identification allowed her to speak about her mother with certainty. It allowed her to correct the record when telling her story. It allowed her to place her own experiences within a clearer framework. This matters more than it might seem. When a loved one disappears without explanation, memory becomes unstable. Stories change over time. Details fade or shift. Identification provides a fixed point. It allows memory to settle. It allows narrative to stabilize. Instead of asking what happened, the question becomes, how do I carry this truth? For many families, this transition is significant. It marks the end of waiting. It marks the beginning of a different kind of processing. There is also a broader impact beyond the family. Cases like Sheila Cummings remind the public that unidentified individuals are not anonymous by choice. They are people whose connections have been interrupted by circumstance. Identification restores those connections. It reminds communities that time does not erase responsibility, that even decades-old cases deserve attention, that persistence can lead to answers. The Nashville case became an example of what modern tools can achieve when combined with careful stewardship of evidence. It demonstrated that cold cases are not static, they are dynamic, changing as technology advances. Public engagement played a role as well. The online post that caught the daughter's attention was not dramatic or sensational. It was informational, it was respectful, and it reached the right person at the right time. This aspect of the case highlights an important shift in how investigations interact with the public. Digital platforms allow information to travel farther than ever before. They allow cases to be seen by people who may have relevant connections. This does not replace professional investigation, it complements it. In this instance, it created a bridge between past and present. For Sheila's daughter, the decision to reach out required courage. It meant reopening a chapter she had lived with quietly for years. It meant inviting uncertainty back into her life, even temporarily. But it also meant trusting the process. That trust was honored. When the confirmation arrived, it did not bring spectacle, it brought truth. And truth, even when complex, has value. The identification of Sheila Cummings did not answer every question surrounding her disappearance. Some details remain unknown. Some circumstances may never be fully understood. But identification is not about answering everything. It is about restoring dignity. It is about ensuring that a person is not lost to history simply because time passed. In this case, dignity was restored through a name, through careful work, through preserved evidence, through a daughter's willingness to look again. As the case file was closed under its updated classification, it no longer represented an unresolved mystery of identity. It represented a completed act of recognition. For the Nashville Police Department, this outcome reinforced the importance of revisiting older cases. For forensic professionals, it affirmed the value of evolving methods. For the public, it offered a reminder that answers can still emerge even after many years. And for Sheila Cummings' daughter, it offered something she had lived without for most of her life: the ability to say with certainty where her mother had been. Not as a rumor, not as a possibility, but as a fact. This clarity does not immediately close every emotional door, but it opens one that had remained locked for decades, the door to understanding. Even after the confirmation of Sheila Cummings' identity, not every question could be answered. Some details about the circumstances surrounding her disappearance remain unclear. The events of 1984, the days leading up to her absence, and the precise journey that led to the discovery of her remains in 1987 are pieces of history that may never be fully reconstructed. Time has a way of preserving certain facts while letting others fade. Equally, the second set of remains found alongside Sheila has not been publicly identified. Investigators have approached this aspect of the case with care and professionalism. While there is progress in forensic science, certain limitations remain when records are incomplete or evidence has aged. The identity of the other individual is a question that continues to exist, separate from Sheila, yet part of the same discovery. The passage of decades inherently limits certainty. Memories fade. Documentation may be partial. Opportunities for first-hand accounts are lost. Even so, the confirmation of Sheila Cummings shows what is possible when patience, technology, and dedication converge. The case leaves a legacy beyond the resolution of a single identity. It demonstrates the importance of preserving evidence. It highlights the role of evolving scientific methods. It emphasizes the power of public engagement in creating connections that would have been impossible in earlier eras. For families who carry the weight of missing loved ones, this case serves as both inspiration and reassurance. Answers, though delayed, can still arrive. The past, while fixed in its reality, can still yield truth. For investigators, it underscores the responsibility to revisit cold cases, to ensure that every file, every photograph, every note is treated as more than a record. It is a story of a person, of a life, and of connections that continue to matter. For the public, it serves as a reminder that even long unresolved cases hold significance. Individuals who were once anonymous are human beings whose identity deserves recognition. Recognition restores history, dignity, and connection. As the story comes to a close, it is appropriate to reflect on its meaning. Some stories wait for technology to catch up with possibility. Some answers arrive decades later, altering understanding and providing clarity. And while not every question is answered, the confirmation of Sheila Cummings replaces decades of uncertainty with knowledge that can be carried forward with respect. In the end, what matters is remembrance, not speculation, not conjecture, not the details lost to time. What matters is honoring the life that existed, acknowledging the story that unfolded, and ensuring that Sheila Cummings is remembered not as a question mark in a file, but as a person restored to history. Her name endures, her story endures, and in that remembrance, the case fulfills its purpose. The legacy of the 1987 discovery on Charlotte Avenue is complete in its most essential form: the restoration of identity, the acknowledgement of family, and the demonstration that answers, no matter how late, still hold profound meaning. Sheila Cummings is remembered. Her story is known. Her life matters.